I am Claire, 30 years old and less than 24 hours before my wedding. My phone rang. It was my father calling to deliver a message that should have broken me. He casually announced he was refusing to walk me down the aisle because seeing me happy would upset my older sister. My mother quickly grabbed the phone, demanding I stop causing drama and just walk myself down the aisle like a modern woman. I did not scream or beg. I simply hung up the phone and made one single call. The next day, when the church doors opened, my father nearly choked on his breath when he saw exactly who was walking me down the aisle. Before I reveal the look on his face and the financial ruin that followed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The bridal suite at the hotel overlooked the sprawling green expanse of Central Park, bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon. I stood perfectly still on a small velvet pedestal while the seamstress carefully pinned the hem of my French silk wedding gown. The atmosphere in the room was a fragile mix of tension and overwhelming hope. Tomorrow I was marrying Nate, a brilliant corporate lawyer who understood me better than anyone else in the world. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool, heavy fabric against my skin, trying to focus on the joy of the moment, rather than the lingering anxiety that always accompanied my family interactions. As the Senior Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions at Caldwell Capital in New York, my daily life was defined by ruthless negotiations, hostile takeovers, and calculating exact margins of risk. I dismantled failing companies and restructured corporate debt for a living. I was completely accustomed to high-pressure environments where one wrong move could cost millions of dollars. Yet standing there in my wedding dress, surrounded by white roses and untouched glasses of expensive champagne, I felt a familiar creeping vulnerability. I had paid for every single detail of this entire $150,000 wedding entirely by myself. My father, Richard, who owned a supposedly prestigious but rapidly failing luxury car dealership in Connecticut, had claimed financial hardship months ago. He told me times were incredibly tough, and that I, being the successful corporate executive, should shoulder the financial burden of my own big day. I had agreed without a second thought, writing the checks and signing the vendor contracts, because I wanted just one weekend of perfect, uninterrupted family harmony. My phone buzzed against the marble surface of the vanity table, interrupting the quiet rustling of the seamstress working around my feet. I glanced over, expecting another sweet, reassuring text message from Nate. Instead, the caller ID flashed my father's name. A cold knot formed instantly in the pit of my stomach. Richard never called me just to check in, especially not on the eve of a major event unless there was a crisis he expected me to manage or accommodate. I motioned for the seamstress to give me a moment of privacy. I picked up the phone and answered, trying to keep my voice light and cheerful. Instead of a warm greeting or words of excitement about tomorrow, Richard cleared his throat with a heavy, dramatic sigh. He sounded burdened, exasperated, and entirely focused on his own discomfort. He told me he was calling to inform me of a slight change in the schedule for tomorrow. I asked him what he meant, assuming he was talking about the transportation logistics or the timing for the family photographs before the ceremony. He stated in a tone so casual it completely defied the magnitude of his words that he would not be walking me down the aisle. The silence on my end of the line was deafening. I gripped the edge of the marble vanity, my knuckles turning white as I asked him to repeat himself. Richard let out another heavy sigh, acting as though I was being deliberately difficult by asking for an explanation. He told me that my older sister Brittany was currently experiencing a massive emotional breakdown. Brittany was 34 years old, completely unemployed, and spent her days masquerading as a wealthy socialite while living entirely off her husband. Her husband, Andre, a deeply kind and hardworking African-American man who owned a highly successful logistics company, was allegedly being cold and distant toward her. According to my father, Brittany was suffering a severe marital crisis. Richard explained that because Brittany was feeling so insecure and neglected in her own marriage, watching me experience the perfect wedding day would be incredibly triggering for her. He said that seeing her father happily give away her younger sister to a successful lawyer would push Brittany over the edge. He told me that as a father, he had to protect his most vulnerable child. And right now, Brittany needed his emotional support far more than I needed a traditional photo opportunity. I stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror, my heart racing, but my corporate instincts kicking in, forcing my voice to remain completely steady. I reminded him that this was my wedding day, an event I had meticulously planned and entirely funded because he claimed he could not afford to help. I asked him how my 34-year-old sister's manufactured marital drama somehow overrode his basic duty to stand by his youngest daughter on the most important day of her life. Richard immediately became defensive, raising his voice to talk over me. He accused me of being completely lacking in empathy. He said I had always been the fiercely independent one, the tough, unfeeling executive who never needed anyone, while Brittany was fragile, sensitive, and required constant parental protection. He started complaining about his dealership, talking about how the threat of bankruptcy was keeping him awake at night, how stressed he was dealing with creditors, and how he simply could not handle my selfish demands on top of his failing business and his eldest daughter's emotional collapse. I pressed him further, pointing out that Andre was an exceptional husband and a patient man, and that Brittany's supposed crises were always perfectly timed to steal the spotlight away from anyone else's achievements. Richard shouted that I was being a jealous, spiteful sister who could not stand to share the attention for even one weekend. Before I could formulate another response, the phone was abruptly snatched away on the other end. My mother Patricia took over the line. Her voice dripped with that fake, suffocating sweetness she had perfected through decades of managing her social image at the local country club. She immediately commanded me to lower my voice despite the fact that I was speaking at a perfectly normal volume. She launched into a masterclass of psychological manipulation, telling me that I needed to be the bigger person and stop throwing a childish tantrum. She told me that I was a 30-year-old woman, a senior vice president, and that a modern, empowered executive like me certainly did not need a man to give her away at the altar. She demanded that I stop making this entire weekend just about myself. The sheer irony of her statement echoed loudly in my mind. I was the bride, and she was telling me to stop making my own wedding about myself so that my unemployed sister could play the victim. I refused to back down. I told Patricia that this was not about modern feminism or independence, but about basic parental loyalty. I brought up our painful history, pulling a specific memory from the depths of my resentment. I reminded her of my master's degree defense 6 years ago. I had worked myself to the bone studying late into the night, while holding down a demanding entry-level job in finance. They had promised to attend the presentation and take me out for a celebratory dinner afterward. But they bailed 2 hours before I took the podium. Their excuse back then was that Brittany had chipped her porcelain veneer right before an exclusive charity gala, and she was so hysterical that Patricia had to rush over to the salon to hold her hand and provide emotional support through the dental emergency. Patricia did not miss a beat. She immediately deployed her favorite tactic, gaslighting me with practiced ease. She told me I was remembering the entire event wrong, that her car had actually broken down, and that my memory was constantly clouded by my bitter, irrational jealousy of my older sister. She said I had a terrible habit of holding on to petty grudges and twisting family history to make myself look like a martyr. Her voice grew sharper, losing its sweet veneer. She told me I was completely ruining the positive energy of the wedding weekend with my toxic negativity. She ordered me to just smile, walk down the aisle solo, and act perfectly normal so I would not embarrass the family in front of Nate's highly respectable, well-connected relatives. She explicitly commanded me to accept the situation gracefully and stop causing unnecessary friction for my father, who was already dealing with enough stress. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg them to reconsider or try to make them understand my pain. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I looked at myself in the mirror again. The vulnerable, hopeful bride who had been standing there 5 minutes ago was completely gone. In her place was the ruthless mergers and acquisitions executive who was known on Wall Street for identifying toxic assets and cutting them loose without a shred of hesitation. My family was a toxic asset, a liability that had been draining my emotional reserves for 3 decades. I wiped a single, barely visible smudge of eyeliner from the corner of my eye. I turned to the seamstress, thanked her politely for her beautiful work, and dismissed her for the evening. Once the heavy, sweet door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet luxury of the room, I picked up my phone. I opened my contacts and dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to Jonathan Caldwell, the 65-year-old billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Caldwell Capital. Jonathan was not just my ultimate boss. Over the past 8 years, he had become my greatest mentor, my strongest advocate, and the closest thing I had ever truly had to a supportive father figure. He had guided my career, celebrated my massive corporate victories, and taught me how to navigate rooms filled with men who constantly underestimated me. He answered on the second ring, his deep, authoritative voice filling the quiet room. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I explained the situation concisely, stripping away the emotion, and presenting the facts of my father's refusal and my mother's manipulation. I then asked him the question. I asked if he would do me the profound honor of walking me down the aisle tomorrow afternoon. Jonathan did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He told me he would be incredibly honored to stand by my side and give me away to Nate. His voice was warm, steady, and filled with the paternal pride my own father severely lacked. Then his tone shifted slightly, adopting the sharp, calculating edge of the billionaire businessman I worked for. He casually mentioned that for the past 8 months, my father Richard had been flooding his executive assistant's inbox with desperate pleading emails. Richard had been begging Caldwell Capital for an $8 million buyout to save his sinking luxury car dealership from total liquidation. Jonathan told me he had ignored every single email delegating all distressed asset acquisitions to my department. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face as the pieces of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. The trap was set. My family thought they had broken my spirit on the eve of my wedding, but they had absolutely no idea that by abandoning me, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute the most brutal, calculated financial takeover of their lives. The private dining room at Le Bernardin hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of clinking crystal and hushed conversations. I had secured the space months ago, putting the entire $15,000 deposit on my personal platinum card. Nate stood beside me near the mahogany bar, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back. At 32, he possessed the sharp, analytical mind of a top-tier corporate litigator, combined with a deeply grounding presence. He looked impeccable in his tailored charcoal suit, projecting the kind of quiet authority my father desperately craved but entirely lacked. We were hosting 40 of our closest friends, and Nate's esteemed colleagues celebrating the final evening before our vows. The atmosphere was flawless, perfectly curated, and completely under my control. Then 45 minutes late, the heavy oak doors swung open. My parents did not just arrive, they made an entrance. Richard marched into the room first, his chest puffed out in a forced display of dominance, scanning the crowd to see who was watching. He wore a tuxedo that was slightly too tight around the waist, an outdated attempt to project wealth he no longer possessed. Patricia followed closely behind her gaze, immediately darting around the room to assess the floral arrangements and the catering, mentally calculating the cost so she could later brag to her country club friends about the lavish event her daughter was throwing. But it was the person trailing behind them that made the entire room fall dead silent. Brittany stepped through the doorway, clinging dramatically to her husband Andre's arm. Andre, a tall, impeccably dressed African-American man who built his logistics empire from the ground up, looked completely exhausted. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, radiating a silent, simmering tension. Brittany, however, was putting on a masterclass in performative victimhood. Her eyes were artificially red-rimmed, her makeup applied to look deliberately smudged, projecting the image of a tragic, fragile heroine enduring immense suffering. Yet it was not her fake tears that caused Nate's grip on my waist to instantly tighten. It was her outfit. My 34-year-old sister was wearing a floor-length ivory silk slip dress. It featured a plunging neckline, a sweeping train, and delicate pearl detailing along the bodice. It was not a cocktail dress. It was not a casual evening gown. It was unmistakably aggressively bridal. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room as my future in-laws stared in absolute disbelief. Wearing white to a wedding event was a well-known faux pas. Wearing an actual ivory silk bridal gown to your sister's rehearsal dinner was a blatant, calculated declaration of war. Patricia spotted me across the room and immediately altered her course, dragging Richard and Brittany directly toward us. She plastered on a wide, artificial smile, completely ignoring the shocked stares of my guests. She reached out, grabbing my arms and kissing the air near my cheeks, her voice ringing out loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. She exclaimed that the traffic from Connecticut was simply atrocious, and that I should have booked a venue closer to the state line to accommodate my family. I did not address the traffic. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Brittany's ivory train, dragging across the carpet. I asked my sister in a perfectly level corporate tone if she had gotten lost on the way to her own vow renewal. Brittany immediately shrank back against Andre, bringing a trembling hand to her chest. She let out a fragile, breathy sigh, claiming she had been in such a state of emotional turmoil all day that she simply grabbed the first thing she saw in her closet. She said she could not possibly be expected to worry about color palettes when her entire marriage was falling apart. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, asking if I was really going to be so shallow and materialistic as to hold a dress against a woman going through a severe psychological crisis. Nate stepped smoothly in front of me, shielding me slightly. He looked Brittany up and down with the clinical detachment he reserved for hostile witnesses on the stand. He pointed out that grabbing a floor-length ivory silk gown with pearl embroidery required a highly specific, deliberate choice, not an accidental fumble in a dark closet. He suggested that if she was truly in such a fragile state, perhaps she should return to the hotel to rest, rather than subjecting herself to an evening of socializing. Patricia instantly went on the offensive, stepping between Nate and her golden child. She accused Nate of being incredibly insensitive to family trauma. She commanded me to control my future husband and demanded that we immediately show some compassion. She insisted that Brittany was making a massive effort just by showing up to celebrate my happiness, while her own life was in shambles. Richard chimed in loudly, backing up his wife, stating that we were wasting time bickering over fabric when he had important guests to mingle with. He adjusted his cufflinks and demanded to know where the open bar was located, acting as though he was the patriarch generously hosting this entire affair. I maintained my composure, refusing to give them the dramatic reaction they so desperately craved. I instructed the waitstaff to direct my father to the bar, and I watched my family march deeper into the room, a parade of toxic entitlement wrapped in ivory silk and fake tears. The evening had barely begun, and the first shot had been fired. The maitre d' gently chimed a crystal glass, signaling the transition from cocktail hour to the formal seated dinner. Nate and I moved toward the center of the room, taking our places at the sweetheart table. I had specifically chosen a private two-seat arrangement, elevated slightly near the bay windows. It was designed to give us a brief sanctuary from the overwhelming social demands of the evening. The rest of the guests, including my family, were assigned to round tables of 8, meticulously organized to ensure lively conversation and minimal friction. I had seated my parents, Brittany and Andre, at table 1, directly adjacent to the dance floor, but comfortably distanced from our private setup. As the guests began finding their beautifully calligraphed name cards, a sudden piercing sob shattered the elegant ambiance. It was not a quiet sniffle. It was a theatrical chest-heaving wail deliberately designed to halt every conversation in the room. I looked up to see Brittany standing rigidly beside table 1. She was clutching her place card as if it were a venomous snake, her ivory silk train pooling around her feet. Andre stood a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, staring straight ahead with an expression of profound, weary stoicism. My mother, Patricia, was already rushing to Brittany's side, cooing loudly and patting her shoulders. Instead of taking her assigned seat, Brittany violently shoved her chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor, forcing everyone to turn and stare. She marched directly toward the sweetheart table, dragging her bridal gown past stunned colleagues and bewildered friends. Patricia trailed right behind her, acting as her personal bodyguard and hype woman. Brittany stopped dead in front of our table. Tears were now streaming freely down her face, ruining her carefully applied mascara. She slammed her hands down on the crisp white linen of our table, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp metallic scent of her expensive perfume. She announced, her voice trembling and artificially amplified for maximum audience coverage, that she absolutely refused to sit at table 1. She stated she could not possibly be expected to sit next to Andre for a 2-hour dinner. She pointed a shaking finger back at her husband, who had not moved an inch. Brittany loudly declared that Andre was emotionally abusing her. She used all the popular psychological buzzwords she had weaponized over the years. She called him a raging narcissist. She claimed he was subjecting her to a cruel and unusual silent treatment, freezing her out and deliberately destroying her mental health. She told the entire room that she was suffering from severe emotional trauma and felt completely unsafe sitting next to the man she had married. The silence in the dining room was suffocating. Nate's senior law partners were staring openly. My corporate mentors were exchanging highly uncomfortable glances. I looked past Brittany and met Andre's eyes. He did not look like an abuser. He looked like a hostage who had finally stopped negotiating. He gave me a barely perceptible shake of his head, silently confirming what I already knew. This was a complete fabrication, a desperate, pathetic play for control and attention. Brittany did not wait for my response. She aggressively grabbed a nearby dining chair from an empty table and began dragging it toward our sweetheart table. She demanded that we make room for her between us. She insisted that she needed to sit at the sweetheart table because it was the only place she would feel protected and loved. She claimed that as my sister, she had a fundamental right to seek sanctuary by my side on a night that was supposed to be about family support. Nate immediately stood up, physically blocking her from wedging the chair between ours. He kept his voice low, firm, and completely devoid of emotion. He told Brittany that this was a sweetheart table designed exclusively for 2 people and there was absolutely no room for a third. He calmly instructed her to return to her assigned seat or step out into the hallway to compose herself. Patricia slammed her hands on her hips, her face flushing a deep, angry red. She loudly chastised Nate for being a cold, heartless brute. She demanded that I order the waitstaff to bring another chair and an extra place setting immediately. Patricia argued that my sister was actively suffering a traumatic marital breakdown and that I was a horrible, ungrateful daughter for refusing to offer her a safe haven. She declared that family always accommodates family regardless of the seating chart or the occasion. I remained seated, resting my hands lightly on the table, channeling every ounce of executive detachment I used during hostile boardroom negotiations. I looked at my sister, taking in the fake tears, the ivory wedding dress, and the desperate hunger for attention burning in her eyes. I told Brittany that she was not going to hijack my rehearsal dinner to stage a fake domestic crisis. I stated clearly that Andre was standing quietly across the room doing absolutely nothing to her. I informed her that if she truly felt unsafe, I would be more than happy to call her an Uber so she could return to the hotel and rest. I explicitly stated that she was not sitting at my sweetheart table, she was not ruining this dinner, and she had exactly 10 seconds to sit down at table 1 or leave the venue entirely. Brittany let out a loud, exaggerated gasp, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. She looked wildly around the room, desperate to see who was buying her performance. That was when my father, Richard, who had been lingering near the bar, stormed over. His face was purple with rage, his fists clenched tight at his sides, ready to unleash the ultimate threat to force my compliance. Richard shoved past a bewildered waiter carrying a tray of appetizers. He marched directly into the tense standoff at the sweetheart table, his presence immediately escalating the situation from a dramatic outburst to a full-scale confrontation. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face, his voice booming across the dining room, ensuring every single guest heard him. He shouted that he was utterly disgusted by my behavior. He claimed that he had raised me to be compassionate and fiercely loyal to my family, not a cold, calculating corporate machine who cared more about a seating chart than her own sister's mental well-being. He declared that Brittany was clearly in distress and that I was completely out of line for humiliating her in front of my future in-laws. He demanded that I immediately apologize to Brittany, order the staff to set up a chair for her between Nate and me, and stop acting like a spoiled, entitled bridezilla. I did not flinch. I kept my gaze locked on him, my posture relaxed but completely unyielding. I asked him in a voice that was quiet but razor-sharp exactly what authority he thought he had to make demands at an event I was hosting. That was the trigger Richard needed. He threw his arms wide, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to assert his dominance over the room. He loudly proclaimed that as the patriarch of the family and the father of the bride, he was the one truly in charge of this entire weekend. He stated that he was the one making this lavish celebration possible. He looked around the room, making eye contact with Nate's senior law partners and my corporate mentors, projecting the image of a wealthy, generous benefactor who was simply trying to manage an unruly, ungrateful daughter. Then he delivered his ultimate ultimatum. He threatened, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, that if I did not instantly accommodate Brittany's request, if I did not stop this disrespectful defiance and show some basic family solidarity, he would pull all of his funding for the wedding. He declared he would cut off the cash flow immediately, cancel his financial support, and leave me to figure out how to pay for the rest of this extravagant weekend on my own. He crossed his arms, a smug, satisfied smirk spreading across his face, fully expecting me to instantly cave under the threat of financial ruin. Patricia nodded vigorously beside him, echoing his threat, warning me that I was about to ruin my own wedding if I did not comply. Brittany sniffled dramatically, leaning against our table, waiting for her victory. Nate let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humor, a cold litigator's laugh that instantly cut through the tension. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of documents. He stepped around the sweetheart table, moving deliberately toward Richard. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, lethal precision of his delivery was far more effective than my father's shouting. Nate stated clearly and audibly for the entire room to hear that he found Richard's threat absolutely fascinating. He slowly unfolded the stack of papers. He explained that as a corporate lawyer, he had a habit of keeping meticulous records of all major transactions, especially those involving his future wife. He held up the first document. He announced that it was the final paid-in-full invoice from the wedding planner, totaling exactly $150,000. He held up the next document. It was the $15,000 receipt for this exact rehearsal dinner. He continued flipping through the papers, listing off the expenses, the floral arrangements, the venue deposit, the catering contract, the photographer. Nate looked directly into Richard's eyes and stated with devastating clarity that every single invoice, every deposit, and every final payment had been processed exclusively through Claire's personal accounts. He loudly clarified that Claire had paid for this entire $150,000 wedding completely by herself. He told the room that Richard had not contributed a single dime to the rehearsal dinner, the ceremony, or the reception. He noted that Richard had not even paid for his own tuxedo rental, which Claire had graciously covered to ensure he looked presentable. Nate dropped the stack of receipts squarely onto the center of the sweetheart table. The heavy thud of the paper sounded like a gavel striking a sound block. He told Richard that it was mathematically impossible to pull funding that never existed in the first place. He advised my father to stop grandstanding, stop lying to our guests, and stop trying to leverage imaginary money to bully his daughter. The color completely drained from Richard's face. His smug smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate a lie, an excuse, a counterattack, but no sound came out. The wealthy, generous patriarch facade he had so desperately tried to project had just been publicly obliterated by a stack of itemized receipts. Patricia looked horrified, her eyes darting around the room, realizing that her country club friends and my prestigious colleagues had just witnessed her husband being exposed as a fraud. Brittany stopped fake crying, her mouth hanging open in shock, staring at the receipts as if they were written in a foreign language. The silence in the room was absolute heavy with the collective realization of my family's staggering audacity. I looked at my father, feeling a cold, clinical satisfaction. I told him that his bluff had been called. I instructed him, my mother, and my sister to return to table 1, sit down, and remain silent for the rest of the evening, or I would have security escort them all out of the building. Before Richard could recover enough to argue, a hand firmly grasped Brittany's shoulder. It was Andre. He had crossed the room silently while Nate dismantled my father. Andre's face was an unreadable mask of tightly controlled fury. He did not look at Richard or Patricia. He looked directly at me, giving a sharp, definitive nod. Then he firmly steered his wife away from our table. As he guided a stunned Brittany back toward their assigned seats, Andre paused briefly near the bay windows. He caught my eye again and tilted his head toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the private balcony. The message was clear. The public execution of my father's lies was only the beginning. The real reckoning was waiting outside. I gave Nate a reassuring squeeze on the arm and navigated through the lingering tension in the dining room. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the private balcony. The crisp New York evening air was a sharp relief from the suffocating perfume and toxic egos inside. Andre was standing near the ornate stone balustrade, his broad shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored suit. He stared out at the city lights, holding a thick manila envelope tightly in his hands. I walked up beside him and asked if he was holding up okay. Andre let out a heavy, exhausted breath. He turned to me, his dark eyes reflecting the glow of the street lamps below. He stated flatly that he had never raised his voice to my sister in his entire life. The alleged emotional abuse she was currently crying about inside was nothing more than him freezing every single credit card attached to his name. He explained that Brittany was throwing a hysterical public tantrum because for the first time in their entire marriage, she had absolutely zero access to his bank accounts. I asked him what triggered the sudden financial cutoff. Andre did not answer immediately. Instead, he held out the manila envelope. The paper felt heavy, packed thick with undeniable proof. He told me to look inside. I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of bank statements, wire transfer logs, and corporate audit reports from his logistics firm. As a mergers and acquisitions executive, I could read financial ruin on a spreadsheet faster than most people could read a novel. What I saw on those printed pages made my blood run instantly cold. Andre explained, his voice low and tight with profound betrayal, that he had trusted Brittany to handle some of the basic vendor payments for his business while his lead accountant was on maternity leave. It was supposed to be a temporary setup, but she had exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The documents in my hands proved that over the last 4 months, my sister had systematically embezzled $300,000 from his corporate accounts. I traced the routing numbers with my manicured finger. The money had not gone to designer clothes, expensive jewelry, or luxury vacations. Every single wire transfer had been deliberately routed directly into offshore holding accounts and domestic shell corporations. I looked up at Andre, the pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapping into place. I asked him who owned the shell companies. Andre gave a bitter, humorless smile. He told me I already knew the answer. The routing numbers on the corporate transfers matched the exact accounts tied to my father's failing luxury car dealership in Connecticut. Brittany had stolen $300,000 from her husband's hard-earned logistics empire to secretly bail our father out of his catastrophic mounting junk debt. Richard had been using his golden child to funnel stolen corporate funds to keep his sinking ship afloat, and they had both played Andre for an absolute fool. I asked Andre what his next move was. He adjusted his jacket, his posture shifting from exhaustion to absolute unshakable resolve. He informed me that his corporate lawyers and forensic accountants had finished their internal investigation yesterday afternoon. He had already signed the divorce papers this morning. Furthermore, he had handed the entire audit over to the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department. He was pressing full criminal charges against Brittany for corporate theft and wire fraud. I asked him why he was here tonight, enduring my sister's pathetic performance inside the restaurant, if the legal guillotine was already primed to drop. Andre looked at me with deep mutual respect. He stated that he knew exactly how much my family had put me through over the years. He knew they were planning to use my wedding weekend to stroke their own fragile egos. He told me he was attending the ceremony tomorrow for one specific reason. He wanted a front row seat to watch their house of cards finally collapse. He tapped the manila envelope in my hands. He said he figured a corporate shark like me could use those illegal wire transfers as leverage for whatever master plan I had brewing. He was absolutely right. The embezzlement documents Andre just handed me perfectly completed the hostile takeover strategy I had initiated with Jonathan Caldwell. Richard and Brittany thought they were financial masterminds. They had no idea they had just armed the two people who were going to legally and publicly obliterate them. I stared at the manila envelope in my hands, feeling the physical weight of the paper inside. I pulled the audit reports back out, holding them up to the dim, ambient light of the balcony sconces. As a mergers and acquisitions executive, I did not just read numbers on a page. I read the panic, the desperation, and the sheer arrogance hiding behind them. I traced a line on the second page of the forensic audit, my eyes scanning the itemized ledger. I looked at Andre and stated that she used ghost vendors. Andre gave a slow, grim nod. He stepped closer to the balustrade, his voice dropping to a low, tight frequency. He explained the exact mechanics of my sister's fraud. He told me that while his lead accountant was on maternity leave, Brittany had exploited her temporary access to the corporate vendor portal. She had created 3 fictitious auto parts suppliers, registering them under generic LLC names in Delaware. Over the course of 4 months, she had systematically approved dozens of fraudulent invoices for non-existent freight shipments. Andre's voice grew harder as he detailed the numbers. He stated that she authorized payments of $25,000 here, $40,000 there. He pointed out that every single wire transfer was deliberately structured to stay just under the $50,000 threshold. That specific number was crucial because anything over $50,000 would have triggered an automatic mandatory review by his chief financial officer. Brittany had studied his company's financial protocols just enough to figure out exactly how to bypass the security measures. I asked him how he finally caught the embezzlement. Andre let out a dry, bitter breath. He told me that for all her calculating arrogance, my sister was fundamentally careless. She had authorized a $30,000 shipment of heavy machinery components using a specialized transport classification code. The problem was that Andre's logistics company did not even operate vehicles with that specific classification. When Andre conducted a routine cross-reference of the quarterly transport codes, the anomaly flagged immediately in the system. The entire facade unraveled in a matter of hours. He explained that he instantly locked her out of the system and hired an independent, ruthless forensic accounting firm to tear through 6 months of financial records. They traced the digital footprints of exactly 12 fraudulent wire transfers. He looked me dead in the eye and stated the final devastating total. It was exactly $312,400 stolen directly from his operating capital. I pulled out my own phone and quickly logged into a secure, highly encrypted file stored on my Caldwell Capital server. I held my screen next to Andre's printed spreadsheet, placing the 2 financial realities side by side. I told him to look very closely at the dates of Brittany's wire transfers. The first major fraudulent transaction occurred on October 12th for $45,000. I pointed to my screen, pulling up Richard's corporate debt profile. I showed Andre that my father's luxury car dealership had a massive non-negotiable balloon payment due on October 15th. The payment was for exactly $45,000 in penalty interest. I continued matching the dates, proving that every single time Brittany stole from Andre, the money was instantly funneled into Richard's failing business accounts just hours before a major default deadline. I explained to Andre the brutal reality of my father's business. I told him that Richard did not just have a struggling dealership, he was buried under $4 million of highly toxic, unmanageable debt. I broke down the numbers for him utilizing the cold, clinical language of my profession. I explained that Richard had leveraged absolutely everything he touched. He had taken out aggressive mezzanine financing against the dealership's inventory, mortgaged the commercial showroom property to the hilt, and leveraged his own personal assets to secure the loans. I stated that he had been actively defaulting on his interest covenants for the past 3 quarters. I watched Andre's eyes widen slightly as I dropped the final piece of the puzzle. I told him that Caldwell Capital, my employer, had purchased Richard's distressed debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar 6 months ago. My father was desperately trying to scrape together enough liquid cash to keep the lights on and maintain his fake wealthy persona. He had used his golden child to steal from her hardworking husband just to cover his minimum interest payments. Andre gripped the cold stone of the balcony railing, his knuckles turning white. He stated that he had suspected Richard was struggling with cash flow, but he never imagined the catastrophic scale of the financial failure. He told me that Brittany had actually cried to him months ago, claiming our father needed a small temporary personal loan of $50,000 to cover an unexpected payroll shortfall. Andre had flatly refused, telling her that mixing family money with corporate business was a fatal error that destroyed relationships. He looked out at the city skyline and stated that when he refused to be an enabler, Brittany decided to stop asking and start stealing. I asked Andre exactly how he planned to drop the hammer at the wedding reception. I needed to know his precise timeline so I could coordinate my own corporate execution flawlessly. I told him we could not step on each other's toes. The destruction of their egos needed to be a perfectly synchronized strike. Andre's expression turned incredibly cold, a look of absolute, unyielding resolve. He told me he was not just going to hand her a manila folder and walk away quietly. He had hired a private process server for tomorrow evening. He explained that the server was going to be dressed in the exact uniform of the catering staff. At exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, right after the main course was cleared, and right before the traditional cutting of the wedding cake, the server would approach Brittany at table 1. She would be handed a silver cloche platter, but instead of dessert, it would contain the official court-stamped divorce filings. But the civil divorce was only the beginning. Andre stated that his corporate attorneys had already submitted the full forensic audit directly to the district attorney's office. Because the stolen funds crossed state lines, moving from his commercial accounts in New York to Richard's fraudulent shell companies in Connecticut, it was no longer just a local matter of embezzlement. He informed me that the authorities were officially categorizing it as a federal wire fraud case. The arrest warrants were already being drafted. I nodded, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The sheer strategic beauty of his plan was flawless. I told Andre that 8 o'clock worked perfectly for my own timeline. I then outlined the exact terms I was bringing to the reception. I explained that my father had been frantically begging my boss, Jonathan Caldwell, for an emergency meeting for the past 8 months. Richard was completely oblivious to the fact that I was the senior vice president, personally handling his specific debt portfolio. I told Andre that my father would inevitably try to corner Jonathan at the reception to pitch a pathetic last-minute bailout plea. When he did, Jonathan would simply step aside and hand the executioner's axe directly to me. I detailed the ultimatum I had drafted. I had a legally binding surrender document ready to be served. Richard would have to sign over the entire dealership, all remaining vehicle inventory, and the commercial property deed directly to Caldwell Capital on the spot. I stated that if he refused to sign, I would initiate hostile liquidation proceedings at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. I would strip him of everything he owned and leave him drowning in $4 million of unsecured personal debt, all while he faced federal investigation for accepting stolen corporate funds. Andre and I stood side by side on the balcony. We were two people who had been relentlessly used, manipulated, and dismissed by the exact same toxic family. Now we held the absolute power to dismantle their fake empire piece by piece. We synchronized our watches. We agreed that the emotional manipulation, the constant gaslighting, and the financial parasitism officially ended tomorrow night. We shook hands. It was not a warm familial embrace. It was a binding corporate agreement between two executives preparing for a hostile takeover of a toxic family dynamic. Andre checked his watch, his face returning to its mask of stoic indifference. He stated that he needed to return inside the restaurant to maintain his cover as the silent, compliant husband for one more night. I nodded, telling him I needed a few more minutes in the cold air to prepare myself to walk back in and face the people whose lives I was about to legally destroy. I took a final deep breath of the freezing night air, letting the chill settle my nerves, and walked back into the rehearsal dinner. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and carefully managed interactions. I kept a polite professional distance from my family, offering nothing but brief, non-committal responses whenever Patricia attempted to engage me in conversation. The tension at table 1 was palpable, but Brittany, thoroughly humiliated by Nate's public display of the receipts, remained uncharacteristically quiet. Andre sat beside her, perfectly composed, playing his part flawlessly. The trap was set, the evidence secured, and the timeline established. Now I just had to get through the next 18 hours. The morning of my wedding began with the kind of chaotic, nervous energy that I usually thrived on. My bridesmaids, a tight-knit group of brilliant, driven women I had met during my MBA program, an early career at Caldwell Capital, bustled around the sprawling hotel suite. Champagne was poured, hair and makeup artists worked with quiet efficiency, and the air was thick with the scent of hairspray and expensive white lilies. For a few precious hours, I allowed myself to just be the bride. I laughed with my friends, drank mimosas, and let the sheer joy of the day wash over me. Nate had sent a handwritten note to my room, delivered along with a single perfect white rose. In it, he promised that no matter what happened today, we were a team, an immovable force, and he loved me exactly as I was. I was sitting in front of the vanity mirror, my hair swept up into an intricate, elegant chignon, when the heavy oak door of the suite burst open. There was no knock, no polite request for entry. Patricia marched into the room with the entitlement of a conquering general. She completely ignored the hair and makeup team, ignored my bridesmaids who stared at her in shock, and most glaringly, completely ignored the fact that her youngest daughter was mere hours away from walking down the aisle. She did not offer a single word of congratulations. She did not tell me I looked beautiful. She did not even ask how I was feeling. Patricia beelined straight for the velvet jewelry box sitting open on the vanity. Inside rested a breathtaking vintage diamond and sapphire necklace. It was a family heirloom from Nate's side, gifted to me by his mother just last night. The necklace was not just stunning, it was a profound symbol of acceptance into a family that actually valued and supported me. Patricia pointed a manicured finger at the glittering diamonds. She commanded in a tone that brooked no argument that she needed to borrow the necklace immediately. She did not ask, she demanded. She stated that Brittany was currently having a catastrophic meltdown in her hotel room down the hall. According to my mother, Brittany was severely depressed, feeling utterly worthless, and consumed by anxiety over her failing marriage to Andre. Patricia explained that the only way to pull her golden child out of this severe depressive episode was to stage an impromptu, glamorous photo shoot. She insisted that wearing a priceless vintage diamond necklace would be the perfect distraction to make Brittany feel beautiful and loved again. I looked at my mother through the reflection in the gilded mirror. The sheer audacity of her request was staggering even by her toxic standards. On the morning of my wedding, she had barged into my sanctuary, completely ignored my milestone, and demanded I hand over a priceless family heirloom from my future mother-in-law so my unemployed, embezzling sister could play dress-up for Instagram. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the fury boiling just beneath my calm exterior. I simply turned around in the chair and looked her dead in the eye. I told Patricia, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that silenced the entire room, that the answer was absolutely not. I stated clearly that the necklace belonged to me, it was a gift from Nate's family, and it was staying locked in this suite until I put it on for the ceremony. I informed her that I was not a prop closet for Brittany's manufactured emotional crises. Patricia's face immediately contorted with rage. She slammed her hand down on the vanity, making the velvet jewelry box jump. She accused me of being incredibly selfish and deeply unsupportive. She loudly proclaimed that Brittany was practically suicidal over her marital issues, and that I was a cold, heartless sister for denying her a simple piece of jewelry that could bring her a moment of joy. She tried to physically reach past me to grab the box, asserting that as my mother, she had the right to redistribute family resources as she saw fit to keep the peace. I moved faster. I snapped the velvet box shut and slid it smoothly into my lap. I looked at Patricia and told her that her blatant favoritism was pathetic, but her timing was even worse. I explicitly stated that Brittany's marriage was not falling apart because of a lack of diamonds or a lack of attention. I told my mother that if she wanted to know why Andre was giving her golden child the cold shoulder, perhaps she should ask Brittany about the $300,000 she had stolen from his logistics company. Patricia froze. Her hand hovered in the air, her angry expression rapidly shifting into one of utter confusion and dawning panic. She demanded to know what on earth I was talking about. She stammered, claiming Brittany would never do something like that my sister was a good, honest person who was simply struggling. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear over the hum of the blow dryers. I told her that Andre's forensic accountants had completed their audit. I told her that the stolen corporate funds had been traced directly to the shell LLCs my father had set up to hide his toxic dealership debt. I watched the blood completely drain from Patricia's face as she realized I knew everything. I knew about the embezzlement, the massive unsecured debt, and the desperate illegal lengths they had gone to just to keep up appearances. I told my mother to get out of my bridal suite. I instructed her to go back down the hall and hold her favorite daughter's hand because by the end of tonight, Brittany was not just going to lose her husband, she was going to lose her freedom. And Richard, the man who demanded absolute respect while secretly living off stolen money, was going to lose everything he had ever built. I warned her that the reckoning was coming tonight, and no amount of vintage diamonds or fake tears could stop it. I pointed toward the door and told her with absolute unwavering finality to get out of my sight. Patricia stumbled backward as if I had physically struck her. The aggressive, entitled matriarch who had barged into my suite just moments ago vanished, replaced by a woman suddenly grasping at the terrifying reality that her carefully constructed world was built on sand. Her mouth worked soundlessly for a few seconds before she finally managed to force out a response. She sputtered, her voice high-pitched and frantic, accusing me of making up vicious, disgusting lies just to ruin the wedding weekend. She claimed I had always been jealous of Brittany's closeness with her father, and that I was fabricating this absurd story about embezzlement to tear the family apart. I stood up from the vanity chair, smoothing the silk skirt of my robe. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute certainty in my tone made the room feel 10 degrees colder. I told Patricia that she could delude herself all she wanted, but the federal investigators, who would be reviewing those wire transfers, would not care about her country club reputation or her golden child's fake tears. I explicitly stated that covering up corporate theft to finance a failing car dealership was a federal offense, and no amount of screaming at me was going to change the forensic audit sitting on Andre's lawyer's desk. Patricia's eyes darted wildly toward my bridesmaids who were standing in stunned silence near the windows. She realized she was losing control of the narrative in front of an audience. She immediately pivoted, trying to leverage maternal guilt. She pressed a hand to her chest, her face twisting into a mask of wounded agony. She wailed that she could not believe her own daughter would speak to her this way on her wedding day. She cried that she and Richard had sacrificed everything to raise me, only for me to turn into a heartless, calculating monster who was actively trying to destroy her sister's life out of sheer spite. I walked toward the heavy oak door of the suite and pulled it open, gesturing for her to leave. I told her that the only people destroying lives in this family were the ones stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a fake lifestyle. I reminded her that while she was busy trying to commandeer my wedding accessories to placate a thief, her husband was currently panicking in his own hotel room, waiting for the massive balloon payment default to hit the wire on Monday morning. I told Patricia that she had exactly two choices. She could walk out of this room right now with whatever shred of dignity she had left, go back to Brittany, and brace herself for the absolute legal and financial devastation coming her way tonight. Or she could stay here and continue throwing a tantrum, in which case I would have hotel security physically remove her from the premises and ban her from attending the ceremony entirely. Patricia stared at me, genuine fear finally overriding her anger. She realized I was not bluffing. The girl who used to crave her approval, the daughter she thought she could bully and manipulate indefinitely, was gone. She was staring at a corporate executioner who held the keys to her family's entire financial existence. She gathered her expensive purse, her hands shaking slightly. She tried to muster one last look of defiance, spitting out that I was going to regret treating my family like disposable garbage. She hissed that when my marriage inevitably failed because I was too cold and focused on my career, she and Richard would not be there to pick up the pieces. I smiled, a sharp, humorless curve of my lips. I told her I would take my chances. I advised her to focus less on my marriage and more on finding a good white-collar defense attorney for her husband and her favorite daughter. I added that she might want to start looking at budget apartments because the sprawling Connecticut estate she loved showing off was heavily leveraged against the dealership, and it was going to be the very first asset liquidated. Patricia did not say another word. She practically fled the room, her designer heels clicking frantically down the carpeted hallway. I closed the heavy oak door, the solid thud echoing through the quiet suite. The air in the room felt instantly lighter, purged of her toxic energy. My maid of honor. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes wide with shock. She asked, her voice hushed, if everything I just said was true. I turned back to the vanity, picking up my makeup brush with perfectly steady hands. I looked at my reflection and then at my closest friends. I confirmed that every single word was true. I told them that my father was completely bankrupt and my sister was a corporate embezzler. I stated that tonight at the reception, the bill for decades of manipulation, financial abuse, and blatant favoritism was finally coming due. I sat back down in the chair, my posture relaxed and commanding. I told the hair and makeup team to continue. The eviction of my mother had not rattled me, it had energized me. I had just drawn the final immovable boundary. The emotional manipulation was over. The gaslighting was finished. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter desperate for a scrap of parental affection. I was the architect of my own life, and I was about to walk down the aisle to marry a man who truly valued me, leaving the wreckage of my toxic family far behind. The countdown to their complete dismantling had officially begun, and I was going to look absolutely flawless when it happened. The final dusting of setting powder felt like putting on war paint. My bridesmaids, sensing the shift in my energy, packed up their bags with quiet efficiency. Sarah gave my shoulders one last reassuring squeeze before ushering the hair and makeup team out into the hallway. She promised to meet me at the elevators in exactly 15 minutes. The moment the suite door clicked shut, a soft, rhythmic knock broke the silence. It was a familiar pattern, 2 quick taps followed by a slow one. It was Nate. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Tradition dictated that the groom should not see the bride before the ceremony, but Nate and I had never operated on outdated superstitions. We operated on strategy, transparency, and absolute partnership. He stepped into the room looking impeccably sharp in his custom black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled. He stopped dead in his tracks the second he saw me. The fierce, calculating litigator melted away, replaced entirely by a man looking at the woman he loved. He did not say a word at first. He just exhaled a long, shaky breath and stepped closer, taking my hands in his. He told me I looked absolutely breathtaking. His thumbs traced small, slow circles on the backs of my hands, a simple grounding gesture that instantly steadied my racing pulse. He noticed the slight tension lingering in my jaw and asked exactly what had just happened. I gave him a concise clinical summary of my mother's invasion, her demand for his mother's vintage diamond necklace, and the subsequent eviction I had just carried out. Nate let out a low, humorless chuckle. He stated that Patricia always possessed an astonishing capacity for terrible timing. He reached up carefully, adjusting a loose strand of hair behind my ear, being mindful of the intricate styling. He looked deeply into my eyes, stripping away all the noise and drama of the morning. He asked me with absolute sincerity if I was truly ready for the massive fallout that tonight would inevitably bring. He reminded me that once we executed this plan, there would be no going back. The bridge to my biological family would not just be burned, it would be permanently vaporized. I looked back at him, feeling a profound sense of clarity. I told him that I had spent 30 years trying to build a bridge across a toxic river that my family constantly flooded. I was tired of drowning. I told him I was not just ready. I was eager to finally cut the anchor. Nate nodded, his expression shifting seamlessly from a loving partner back to the lethal corporate attorney I was about to marry. We moved to the small seating area by the window, keeping our voices low, reviewing the execution timeline one last time. He confirmed that the private process server had successfully infiltrated the venue. The server was currently prepping in the hotel kitchens, carrying the manila envelope containing Brittany's divorce papers and the federal embezzlement notification. Nate outlined the exact logistics. At 8 o'clock tonight, immediately following the main course, the server would approach table 1. He confirmed that Andre was entirely on board and ready to step out of the blast radius the second the documents were delivered. I nodded, running through my own checklist. I informed Nate that Jonathan Caldwell had texted me 10 minutes ago. My mentor was currently waiting in the VIP holding room near the chapel entrance, fully briefed and ready to take my father's place for the walk down the aisle. We discussed the reception ambush. I confirmed that Richard's massive debt default was officially queued up in the Caldwell capital system. The hostile liquidation paperwork was sitting securely in my leather briefcase, which Sarah was currently guarding with her life. When Richard inevitably cornered Jonathan to beg for a financial lifeline, the trap would spring shut. We anticipated my father's exact psychological response. He would panic, he would try to leverage his relationship with me, and he would ultimately fail because he had absolutely zero leverage left. Nate pulled me in by the waist, being careful not to crush the silk of my gown. He kissed my forehead, a firm, grounding pressure. He told me that we were about to execute the most flawless corporate restructuring of our lives, and we were going to do it while hosting the best party New York had seen all year. I looked up at him, feeling an overwhelming surge of love and absolute certainty. We were an impenetrable front. No emotion was wasted on guilt or hesitation. Every move had been calculated, every contingency planned for. We stepped away from the window, walking side by side toward the heavy oak door. The calm was officially over. It was time to start the war. Nate kissed my cheek one last time before slipping out the side exit to take his place at the altar. I made my way down the carpeted hallway toward the main vestibule of the historic chapel. The air was thick with the scent of burning beeswax candles and fresh orchids. The muffled sounds of a string quartet warming up bled through the heavy wooden doors. I stood in the shadows of the antechamber, smoothing the front of my silk gown, listening to the low hum of 200 guests settling into the pews. Inside that chapel sat a carefully curated assembly of New York's corporate elite. There were senior partners from Nate's law firm, managing directors from Caldwell Capital, and a handful of federal judges. It was a room filled with people who calculated risk and recognized power dynamics for a living. And sitting right in the very first row, occupying the prime aisle seat designated for the father of the bride, was Richard. Through a slight crack in the vestibule doors, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my family. Richard was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He leaned back against the polished oak pew, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His posture screamed defiance and arrogant triumph. He was actively performing for the people around him, whispering to Patricia with a cruel, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He fully believed he had won. He was absolutely certain that he had broken me. In Richard's mind, he had executed the ultimate power play. By refusing to walk me down the aisle at the 11th hour, he expected me to crumble. He was eagerly waiting for the heavy wooden doors to swing open so he could watch his fiercely independent corporate executive daughter walk down that long, intimidating aisle completely alone. He wanted the entire congregation of high-powered guests to see me looking unsupported, pathetic, and isolated. He wanted to visually broadcast that despite all my financial success, I was still just a desperate, unloved child who was nothing without her father's blessing. He craved the whispers of the crowd, assuming they would pity the bride, who could not even secure her own family's loyalty on her wedding day. Patricia sat right beside him, her spine rigidly straight, her chin tilted up in a practiced pose of aristocratic superiority. She occasionally patted Richard's arm, validating his cruel disciplinary tactic. Next to them sat Brittany, still shamelessly sporting her floor-length ivory silk gown. She looked around the chapel with hungry, darting eyes, clearly hoping people would mistake her for the bride, or at least whisper about her tragic beauty. However, Brittany's smugness was visibly cracking around the edges. Andre sat on her opposite side, leaving a massive, deliberate gap of physical space between them. He stared straight ahead at the altar, his face an impenetrable mask of cold granite, refusing to acknowledge her whispers or her frantic attempts to grab his sleeve. The string quartet seamlessly transitioned from their prelude into the grand, sweeping chords of the processional march. The low murmur of the crowd instantly hushed. A wave of collective anticipation swept through the chapel. The groomsmen and bridesmaids had already taken their places at the front, standing in perfect symmetry. The officiant stepped up to the altar. The guests rose to their feet in unison, turning their bodies toward the back of the chapel, waiting for the traditional emotional entrance of the bride. Richard did not stand up immediately. He took his time, making a theatrical show of rising from his seat, puffing out his chest, and turning around with that same arrogant sneer. He was preparing to bask in my public humiliation. He wanted to lock eyes with me as I walked out solo and let me know exactly who was in charge. Back in the dim light of the vestibule, I did not feel an ounce of panic. I felt the steady, surging adrenaline of a perfectly executed corporate strike. Heavy footsteps echoed behind me on the marble floor. I turned away from the crack in the doors to see Jonathan Caldwell stepping into the antechamber. My boss mentor and the reigning titan of Wall Street looked commanding in a classic bespoke tuxedo. He stopped beside me, his presence immediately filling the small room with an aura of absolute untouchable authority. He looked down at me, his eyes crinkling warmly. He told me I looked like a woman ready to close the biggest deal of her career. I smiled a genuine, relaxed expression and told him the contract was already signed. We were just here to collect the assets. Jonathan chuckled a deep, resonant sound. He extended his right arm toward me. He asked if I was ready to show the people in that room exactly what true power and loyalty looked like. I slid my hand into the crook of his arm, feeling the solid, unwavering support that my own father had never possessed the character to provide. I nodded. I signaled the wedding coordinator to cue our entrance. I took a deep breath, perfectly aligning my posture. I was not walking out there as a discarded daughter. I was walking out there as a conqueror. The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung open with a smooth, dramatic finality. The bright, warm light of the sanctuary poured into the dim vestibule, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The string quartet hit the crescendo of the processional march, the music swelling to fill the vaulted ceilings. I stepped forward into the threshold, Jonathan Caldwell's arm a steady, immovable anchor beneath my hand. We paused for a fraction of a second at the top of the aisle, allowing the visual impact of our entrance to fully register with the 200 guests. I looked flawless, projecting an image of absolute, untouchable power. My French silk gown moved with fluid grace, but it was my posture that commanded the room. I stood with the rigid, perfectly balanced alignment of an executive preparing to deliver a crushing boardroom presentation. There was no hesitation in my step, no trembling in my hands, and absolutely no vulnerability in my expression. I was not the tragic, abandoned bride my family had anticipated. I was a force of nature, and the man holding my arm was the architect of modern Wall Street. Jonathan Caldwell did not simply walk, he progressed with the terrifying, majestic momentum of an incoming tide. He projected a level of wealth and influence that made the air around him feel physically heavier. The contrast was devastatingly stark. Richard, standing in the front row, was a man drowning in a puddle of local desperate debt. Jonathan Caldwell was the ocean. A collective audible gasp rippled through the congregation. It started near the back pews and surged forward like a physical wave. The guests were predominantly top-tier legal and financial professionals individuals who spent their entire careers analyzing power structures and identifying key players. They instantly recognized the man walking me down the aisle. The whispers erupted immediately, a frantic buzzing undercurrent beneath the elegant music. I heard snippets of conversation as we took our first slow steps down the carpeted aisle. I heard a senior partner from Nate's law firm mutter Jonathan Caldwell's name in a tone of absolute reverence and shock. I saw managing directors from rival investment banks exchange wide-eyed, bewildered glances. They were rapidly recalibrating their entire understanding of my professional and personal influence. Having the notoriously reclusive billionaire CEO of Caldwell Capital step in to give away a bride was not a casual favor. It was a massive, incredibly public endorsement of my value. It signaled to everyone in that room that I was not just a senior vice president. I was Caldwell's chosen protege operating under his direct personal protection. The power dynamic of our walk was suffocatingly intense. We moved in perfect synchronized rhythm, presenting a united front that completely dominated the space. Jonathan did not look at the crowd. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead toward the altar, his expression a mask of patrician stoicism. I kept my chin high, sweeping my eyes over the guests with calm, acknowledging nods, acting entirely unfazed by the seismic shockwave we had just unleashed. The whispers intensified as we approached the middle of the aisle. The narrative my parents had carefully constructed, that I was a difficult, estranged daughter who could not even secure her own father's loyalty, was instantly incinerated. The crowd was no longer pitying me for walking alone. They were actively intimidated by the caliber of the man who had chosen to walk beside me. The pity completely vanished, replaced by an electric, almost fearful respect. I was not the victim of a family dispute. I was a woman wielding a level of social and corporate capital that Richard could not even comprehend, let alone control. As we neared the front rows, the physical manifestation of my family's panic became undeniable. The smug, self-satisfied aura that had surrounded Table 1 during the rehearsal dinner had evaporated. The sheer gravitational pull of Jonathan Caldwell's presence was actively crushing the oxygen out of their section of the chapel. My mother Patricia looked as though she was physically shrinking into the polished wood of the pew. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white, her carefully maintained country club composure fracturing into pure, unadulterated terror. Brittany, still wearing her inappropriate ivory silk gown, looked utterly pathetic. The dress that was meant to steal focus and provoke outrage now just looked desperate and cheap when contrasted against the sheer, undeniable reality of true power. She was staring at Jonathan with her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process how her manufactured crisis had resulted in me securing an upgrade of astronomical proportions. She looked around the chapel, desperately seeking the sympathetic glances she thrived on, but found absolutely none. Every single eye in the room was locked onto me and the billionaire escorting me. Andre remained completely still, his posture rigid, but the subtle approving tension in his jaw told me everything I needed to know. He was watching the opening act of the destruction we had planned on the balcony. He saw the trap closing, and he recognized the absolute brutal efficiency of the execution. We took the final steps toward the altar, the string quartet holding the last resonant chord. We stopped exactly at the edge of the first row, positioning ourselves directly in front of my father. The physical proximity was deliberate and overwhelming. Jonathan stopped smoothly, turning slightly to face me. He did not immediately hand me over to Nate. He took a long, calculated pause, allowing the profound weight of the moment to settle heavily over the congregation, ensuring that every single person in the room witnessed the exact moment the power definitively shifted. Richard had been perfectly poised to gloat. He had spent the last 24 hours inflating his chest with the belief that he had successfully broken his insubordinate daughter. He had envisioned this exact moment, waiting for the heavy wooden doors to open, expecting to see Claire isolated, vulnerable, and deeply regretting her refusal to bow to his authority. He had planned to catch her eye delivering a subtle, triumphant smirk, that confirmed his absolute control over the family dynamic. When the processional music swelled, Richard shifted in his front row seat, leaning forward slightly eager to consume her humiliation. Then the doors opened. The smirk froze on his face. The man walking beside his daughter was not a generic groomsman or a random uncle pulled in at the last minute. The man anchoring Claire with terrifying, unshakable authority was Jonathan Caldwell. For 2 agonizing seconds, Richard's brain simply refused to process the visual information. The cognitive dissonance was too extreme. He blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling to reject the reality standing 10 feet away from him. It had to be a mistake. A hallucination brought on by stress. But as the pair moved out of the dim vestibule and into the bright light of the chapel, the harsh, undeniable truth slammed into Richard with the force of a freight train. It was Caldwell. The Jonathan Caldwell. The blood rushed from Richard's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His heart hammered against his ribs with a violent, erratic rhythm, a sudden cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The suffocating weight of sheer, unadulterated panic crushed the air from his lungs. For the past 8 months, Jonathan Caldwell had been the singular obsession of Richard's desperate, failing existence. Richard's luxury car dealership empire, built entirely on heavily leveraged toxic debt, was collapsing inward. He was drowning in $4 million of immediate liabilities, facing foreclosure on his commercial properties and fighting off creditors who were circling like vultures. The only lifeline, the only possible salvation for his ruined legacy, was securing an $8 million bailout from Caldwell Capital. Richard had humiliated himself trying to get Caldwell's attention. He had sent hundreds of frantic, groveling emails to Caldwell's executive assistants. He had FedExed physical proposals bound in expensive leather. He had staked out charity galas and industry conferences, desperately trying to orchestrate an accidental meeting with the elusive billionaire, only to be seamlessly intercepted and dismissed by Caldwell's private security detail. Caldwell had ignored every single overture, treating Richard not as a peer, but as a non-existent nuisance. And now the man who held Richard's entire financial survival in the palm of his hand was walking the daughter Richard had just discarded down the aisle. The psychological terror gripping Richard was absolute. It was not just the shock of seeing Caldwell. It was the horrifying realization of the power dynamic he had just completely miscalculated. He looked at Claire. He really looked at her. For decades he had viewed her as a minor annoyance, an overly serious child who refused to play her assigned role as the supporting cast to Britney's golden child narrative. He had dismissed her career as finance stuff, assuming she was just another mid-level corporate drone pushing paper in a cubicle. But the woman walking down the aisle was not a drone. The way Caldwell moved with her, the subtle deference in the billionaire's posture, the synchronized predatory rhythm of their steps, it communicated an undeniable, terrifying truth. Caldwell did not view Claire as an employee. He viewed her as an equal. He viewed her as a protégé. Richard's mind spun frantically, connecting the dots that he had willfully ignored for years. Claire worked at Caldwell Capital. He knew that. He had always known that. But he had never bothered to ask her what her actual title was. He had never bothered to understand the scope of her influence because he was too busy indulging Britney's manufactured dramas. A sickening wave of realization washed over him. He had spent 8 months begging Caldwell Capital for an $8 million lifeline. If Claire possessed the kind of power that prompted the CEO to step in as her proxy father, then Claire must have known about the emails. She must have known about the debt. She must have watched him groveling, knowing exactly how desperate he was, and she had said absolutely nothing. The panic morphed into a visceral, paralyzing fear. Richard was sitting down. He was literally sitting on his hands in the front pew, watching his ultimate savior escort the daughter he had just severely punished. The social protocol of the moment demanded action, but Richard was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to stand up. He needed to assert himself. He needed to project the image of the wealthy, connected patriarch. He needed to leap to his feet, flash a booming, familiar smile, and act as though he and Jonathan Caldwell were old golfing buddies sharing a touching family moment. He needed to reclaim the narrative before his peers and colleagues realized he was an outsider at his own daughter's wedding. Richard's muscles twitched. He planted his polished shoes against the marble floor, gripping the polished wood of the pew in front of him. He prepared to shove himself upward, ready to deploy the aggressive false charm he used to bulldoze his way through difficult dealership negotiations. He moved to stand. But as he lifted an inch off the pew, Jonathan Caldwell's gaze snapped directly to him. It was not a friendly glance. It was a targeted, lethal assessment. Caldwell's eyes, cold and flinty, locked onto Richard with the absolute devastating precision of a sniper. The look contained no warmth, no recognition, and certainly no respect. It was the look a titan of industry reserves for a remarkably annoying insect. Caldwell did not break his stride. He did not alter his expression. He simply held Richard's gaze and let the sheer, crushing weight of his billionaire authority bear down on the failing car dealer. The message transmitted in that split second of eye contact was unmistakable. Do not move. Do not speak. You are nothing. The invisible force of Caldwell's disdain hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. The false charm evaporated instantly. The aggressive posture dissolved. Richard's knees buckled under the immense unspoken pressure. He sank heavily back down onto the wooden pew, his body rigid, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was trapped. He could not stand up to greet the man holding his daughter's arm because standing up would invite public annihilation. He had to sit there sweating through his rented tuxedo, acutely aware that the elite guests surrounding him were witnessing his total subjugation. Beside him, Patricia was oblivious to the financial apocalypse currently melting her husband's brain. She was staring at Claire with a mix of fury and confusion, her mouth pinched into a tight, disapproving line. She leaned close to Richard, hissing under her breath, demanding to know who the arrogant man was that Claire had hired to make a scene. Richard could not answer her. His throat was bone dry. He gripped his own knees to hide the violent trembling in his hands. He watched as Claire and Caldwell stopped directly in front of him. He looked up at his daughter. Claire did not look angry. She did not look hurt. She looked down at him with an expression of complete chilling indifference. It was the look of an executive who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover and was now simply observing the former management being escorted from the building. In that agonizing, silent moment, the full catastrophic scope of his error settled into Richard's bones. He had tried to break his daughter by denying her his presence. Instead, he had handed her the perfect opportunity to publicly demonstrate that she had long ago outgrown her need for him and that she possessed the power to utterly destroy him. The man he needed for survival was the man acting as her shield, and Richard was completely, terrifyingly alone. The string quartet played the final lingering note of the processional march, letting the beautiful sound dissolve into the high-vaulted ceiling of the chapel. A profound, expectant silence fell over the room. We stood dead center at the foot of the altar, directly in front of the first pew, where my biological family sat frozen in their own manufactured nightmare. Jonathan Caldwell did not immediately release my arm. He stood tall, radiating an imposing gravitational authority that commanded absolute attention from every high-powered guest in the room. The officiant, a distinguished judge who had known Nate for years, stepped up to the microphone. His voice echoed clearly through the silent chapel, asking the traditional question of who gives this woman to be married to this man. In a standard ceremony, this would be the moment the father of the bride stood up, murmured a polite response, kissed his daughter's cheek, and retreated to his seat. Richard remained completely paralyzed. His hands gripped his knees, his knuckles white, his breath hitching audibly in the quiet room. He waited for Jonathan to offer a standard polite reply, perhaps hoping the billionaire would show some social grace and let the moment pass smoothly. Jonathan did not do polite. Jonathan did corporate executions. He turned his body, slightly angling himself so his voice projected flawlessly across the front rows, ensuring the managing directors, the senior law partners, and the federal judges heard every single syllable. He looked down at Richard, his expression a mask of cold, uncompromising judgment. Jonathan stated in a booming, resonant voice that required no microphone that he gave this woman away. But he did not stop there. He held Richard's terrified gaze and delivered a calculated, devastating remark. He declared that it was his absolute honor to stand in for those who lacked the vision to see a blue-chip asset when it was sitting right in front of them. He told the entire congregation that loyalty is not inherited through biology, but earned through unwavering support. He looked directly into my father's panicked eyes and announced that today he was proud to show everyone exactly what a real family looks like. A real family invests when things are hard, protects their own at all costs, and never ever walks away from a bad investment just to save their own ego. The words landed like physical blows. The subtext was blindingly obvious to the corporate titans sitting in the pews. They all knew Richard's luxury car dealership was a distressed asset. They all knew Caldwell Capital specialized in ruthless acquisitions. They instantly understood the metaphor Jonathan was using. He was not just giving away a bride. He was publicly condemning a man for bankrupting both his financial and familial obligations. A collective low murmur of pure shock rippled through the chapel. My mother. Patricia let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying to her throat as the humiliation finally registered. She realized that her carefully curated country club image was being publicly incinerated by a billionaire in front of the most elite social circle in New York. Brittany shrank down in her seat, pulling her inappropriate ivory silk gown tightly around her legs, suddenly wanting nothing more than to be completely invisible. Jonathan turned his attention away from my destroyed family and looked at me. His cold, clinical demeanor vanished, replaced by genuine paternal warmth. He kissed my cheek, a firm, affectionate gesture, and whispered that it was time to go close the deal. He stepped forward and placed my hand directly into Nate's waiting palm. The physical transfer was deliberate and powerful. Nate clasped my hand tightly, his grip warm and incredibly grounding. The two men exchanged a look of deep mutual respect. It was a silent acknowledgement between titans, confirming that the transfer of care was complete. Jonathan stepped back, taking a seat of honor in the front row directly across the aisle from my biological family, acting as a permanent, intimidating sentinel for the remainder of the ceremony. Nate led me up the short flight of marble stairs to the altar. We turned to face each other, joining both hands. The chaos of my family, the financial warfare, and the toxic drama instantly faded into the background. I looked into Nate's eyes and saw nothing but absolute certainty and unwavering partnership. The officiant guided us through the ceremony, but the true emotional core of the event came when we exchanged our personalized vows. We had written them together, treating them not just as romantic promises, but as a binding contract of mutual respect and unbreakable loyalty. Nate spoke first. His voice was strong, carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. He did not talk about fairy tales or destiny. He talked about building an empire together. He vowed to be my fiercest advocate in the boardroom and my safest sanctuary at home. He looked at me with a fierce, unwavering devotion and promised that our partnership would never be subject to market fluctuations or emotional manipulation. He explicitly stated that he would choose me every single day, in every single situation, and that he would never let anyone disrespect the life we were building. His words were a direct surgical strike against the conditional fragile love my parents had modeled my entire life. When it was my turn, my voice did not shake. I held his hands and delivered my vows with the absolute conviction of a woman who had finally found her true equal. I promised to value his honesty over his compliance. I vowed to never use our vulnerabilities as weapons, and to always protect the foundation of our marriage against outside interference. I looked at the man who had effortlessly dismantled my father's financial threats just a few hours earlier, and I promised to fiercely defend our chosen family. I declared that the legacy we were starting today would be built on transparency, accountability, and a love that required absolutely no performance to maintain. Our vows highlighted the devastating contrast between healthy chosen love and the toxic decaying bloodlines sitting in the front row. We were actively breaking generational curses with every promise we made. We were laying the groundwork for a future where manipulation had no currency and gaslighting was immediately neutralized by truth. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, Nate did not hesitate. He pulled me in and kissed me with a passionate, triumphant finality. The chapel erupted into applause. It was not polite, obligatory clapping. It was thunderous, genuine celebration from a crowd that had just witnessed the ultimate victory of resilience over toxicity. We turned to face our guests, our hands raised and joined together. I looked out over the sea of cheering faces, my gaze sweeping past the first row entirely. I did not look at Richard. I did not look at Patricia. I did not look at Brittany. They had been officially demoted from my life, relegated to the status of distressed written-off liabilities. As the string quartet struck up a joyous, upbeat recessional, Nate and I marched back down the aisle. We were an impenetrable, unstoppable team, walking away from the wreckage of my past and heading straight toward the reception, where the final fatal corporate blow was waiting to be delivered. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a masterpiece of modern elegance transformed into a sprawling landscape of white orchids and the low, sophisticated hum of New York's corporate elite networking over top-tier champagne. Nate and I entered to a standing ovation, the triumphant energy of the chapel carrying over into the evening. We immediately took our places at the center of the room, seamlessly greeting colleagues and friends, projecting the absolute unity we had just sworn at the altar. My biological family arrived 20 minutes later, looking less like wedding guests and more like survivors of a shipwreck. They hovered awkwardly near the entrance, completely stripped of their usual arrogant bravado. Brittany was practically hyperventilating. Her desperate stunt with the ivory silk dress had been a catastrophic failure, resulting only in her complete social isolation. No one was looking at her. She was entirely invisible, in a room full of people who only cared about actual influence. She collapsed into a velvet chair near the coat check, burying her face in her hands and launching into a dramatic, heaving sob. She wailed that she was being actively bullied and that she needed her father to go yell at someone immediately to fix her ruined evening. Patricia instantly dropped to her knees beside the chair, frantically rubbing Brittany's back, whispering reassurances, and desperately trying to shield the golden child from the judging stares of passing waiters. Patricia looked up desperately, searching for her husband to step in and play the aggressive protector. But Richard was not looking at his weeping favorite daughter. His eyes were locked on a target entirely across the ballroom. Standing near the custom mahogany bar holding a tumbler of aged scotch was Jonathan Caldwell. In a split second, the illusion of Richard's devoted fatherhood completely vanished, overridden by sheer unadulterated financial panic. He did not hesitate. He did not check on his crying daughter. He completely abandoned his supposedly fragile child and his frantic wife, leaving them sobbing in the coat check area. He aggressively pushed his way through a group of my university friends, his eyes manic and fixated solely on the billionaire who held the keys to his financial survival. I watched the entire sequence unfold from the dance floor, my hand resting lightly in Nate's. I gave Nate a subtle nod. The target was moving exactly as predicted. Richard practically sprinted across the polished marble floor. He was sweating profusely, his face flushed a dark, unhealthy red against the stiff collar of his rented tuxedo. He aggressively shoved his way up to the mahogany bar, deliberately positioning his body to physically block Jonathan into the corner. He trapped the billionaire against the brass railing, ignoring every rule of corporate etiquette and basic personal space. Jonathan did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, his expression shifting into a mask of mild anthropological curiosity. He looked at my father the way a scientist might observe a particularly desperate dying insect trapped in a jar. Richard launched immediately into his pitch, his voice pitched loud and frantic over the ambient jazz music. He did not offer congratulations on the ceremony. He did not introduce himself politely. He threw his hands out, adopting a fake, booming joviality, attempting to project the illusion that they were two industry titans catching up at the country club. He started rapid-firing financial buzzwords, his desperation bleeding through every single syllable. He loudly declared that his luxury car dealership in Connecticut was sitting on a goldmine of untapped equity. He claimed he was on the verge of a massive regional expansion and just needed a tiny, insignificant bridge loan to clear a temporary cash flow hurdle. He told Jonathan that $8 million was pocket change for Caldwell Capital, but it would guarantee an astronomical risk-free return on investment within 6 months. Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, desperate whisper. He told Jonathan that they were both men of the world, men who understood how to leverage a crisis into an opportunity. He aggressively insisted that Jonathan needed to bypass his standard executive review board and approve the cash injection tonight right here at the bar. He promised to hand over 20% of his commercial real estate equity as collateral, acting as though he was offering the billionaire the deal of a lifetime. He was sweating so heavily that droplets were running down his temples. He begged for just a 5-minute sit-down in a private room to sign a preliminary term sheet. He reached out, actually attempting to grab Jonathan's tailored sleeve to emphasize his desperation. Jonathan smoothly shifted his arm out of reach. He did not break eye contact. He let Richard ramble on, allowing my father to completely exhaust his pathetic arsenal of lies and inflated equity projections. The trap was wide open, and Richard had just sprinted headfirst into the very center of it. Jonathan Caldwell did not flinch. He let the silence stretch out, weaponizing the quiet seconds between them until the air felt heavy enough to crush bone. He slowly lowered his crystal tumbler to the polished mahogany bar. He did not look at Richard with anger or outrage. He looked at him with the profound clinical boredom of a man who dealt with global economies suddenly forced to swat away a very persistent gnat. Richard was panting slightly, his eyes wide and feverish, waiting for the billionaire to enthusiastically agree to his delusional terms. He offered a shaky, desperate smile, trying to force a camaraderie that absolutely did not exist. Guests standing nearby had stopped their conversations, their attention drawn by Richard's loud, frantic pitching. They watched with a mixture of second-hand embarrassment and predatory interest. Jonathan finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp frequency that instantly cut through the surrounding jazz music and the clinking of champagne glasses. He told Richard that he was speaking entirely too loudly for a man who was currently $4 million in the red. The shaky smile on Richard's face instantly died. His jaw dropped open, a sudden panicked breath hitching in his chest. He stammered, attempting to backtrack frantically, trying to generate a lie about miscalculated quarterly projections or temporary supply chain disruptions. Jonathan held up a single perfectly manicured finger, instantly silencing the failing car dealer. He told Richard to save his breath because he absolutely despised bad fiction. Jonathan stated with chilling precision that Caldwell Capital had already run the advanced algorithms on every single asset tied to the Connecticut dealership. He methodically dismantled Richard's fake pitch right there at the bar, exposing the raw, bleeding truth of his finances to anyone standing within earshot. He explicitly noted that the commercial real estate was heavily mortgaged to 3 different predatory lenders. The showroom inventory was actively depreciating by the hour, and the local brand reputation was completely toxic. Jonathan leaned in just a fraction of an inch, his eyes locked onto Richard's sweating face. He informed my father that his business was not a gold mine of untapped equity. It was a rotting, sinking liability. He told Richard that blind hope was not a valid corporate strategy, and cornering a guest at a wedding reception to beg for a bailout was the ultimate pathetic symptom of terminal insolvency. Richard physically recoiled, staggering back half a step as if Jonathan had struck him across the face. The manic fake confidence he had projected just moments ago completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, desperate old man. He abandoned the corporate pitch and shifted instantly to raw begging. His voice cracked as he pleaded with Jonathan, insisting that he just needed a tiny fraction of the $8 million to keep the bank from locking his doors on Monday. He promised he would pay any interest rate, sign any draconian contract, and surrender any amount of collateral. He literally clasped his hands together, his dignity entirely abandoned on the ballroom floor. Jonathan picked up his crystal tumbler and took another slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. He swallowed, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. He explained to Richard, speaking slowly, as if addressing a particularly slow child, that there was a fundamental misunderstanding of how a Tier 1 investment firm operated. He stated that as the chief executive officer of Caldwell Capital, his daily operations involved managing global market shifts, orchestrating international mergers, and overseeing multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisitions. He looked at Richard's cheap rented tuxedo with overt disdain, and explicitly stated that he did not personally handle microacquisitions. He told my father that he absolutely never touched regional bankruptcies, and he certainly did not waste his time evaluating the distressed garbage debt of a failing suburban car salesman. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. The utter contempt in Jonathan's voice was unmistakable. Richard realized he was completely out of his depth, but his sheer desperation pushed him forward. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand and asked, his voice shaking, who he needed to speak to. He begged Jonathan to just point him in the right direction, to give him a name, a phone number, or an email address of whoever handled these microscopic accounts at the firm. Jonathan offered a cold, predatory smile. It was a smile that promised absolute, inescapable destruction. He explained that Caldwell Capital had an entire, highly specialized department dedicated exclusively to liquidating toxic family businesses exactly like his. He stated that he delegated all hostile buyouts, all bankruptcy restructuring, and all distressed asset acquisitions to his senior vice president of mergers and acquisitions. Jonathan described this specific executive to Richard in vivid, terrifying detail. He stated that his senior vice president was the most ruthless, brilliant, and unyielding shark in the entire financial sector. He told my father that this executive specialized in buying bad debt for pennies on the dollar and stripping the remaining assets down to the copper wiring without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. Richard's eyes widened with a frantic, desperate glimmer of hope. He did not care how ruthless the executive was. He just saw a target he could manipulate. He eagerly asked Jonathan for the vice president's name, promising he would set up a meeting first thing Monday morning, swearing he could convince them that his dealership was worth saving. Jonathan set his glass down on the bar with a definitive ringing clink. He looked over Richard's shoulder, his cold smile widening into something almost genuinely amused. He told my father that a Monday morning meeting would be completely unnecessary. He stated that his senior vice president of mergers and acquisitions was actually highly accessible tonight. In fact, Jonathan noted the executive holding the absolute power to either save or destroy Richard's entire financial existence was standing directly behind him. Richard froze. The air left his lungs in a sharp, jagged exhale. He turned around with agonizing slowness, his expensive rented shoes dragging against the polished marble floor. His eyes darted past the groups of staring guests, expecting to see a ruthless silver-haired executive in a tailored suit waiting to dismantle his life. Instead, his frantic gaze slammed directly into me. I stood exactly 3 feet away from him, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. I did not look like a frightened daughter, and I certainly did not look like the scapegoat he had punished yesterday evening. I looked him up and down with absolute chilling indifference. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch until the tension was thick enough to choke on. I lowered the glass, maintaining unbreakable eye contact, and offered a razor-sharp corporate smile. I told my father that it was incredibly convenient he wanted to schedule a Monday morning meeting because my calendar was actually wide open for a hostile liquidation. Richard's jaw unhinged. He looked from me to Jonathan, then back to me, his brain completely short-circuiting as he tried to process the impossible reality standing in front of him. He let out a breathless, confused stammer. He instinctively tried to assert his parental authority, ordering me to step aside and stop playing silly games while he conducted serious business with my boss. I did not move an inch. I stepped closer, invading his personal space, weaponizing my height and my bridle heels. I told him to shut his mouth and listen very carefully because I was only going to explain his financial execution once. I stated my full official title, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. I announced that I was the Senior Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions for Caldwell Capital. I explicitly clarified that I was the exact executive Jonathan had just described. I was the shark. I was the executioner. I was the person who held the absolute uncontested authority to either restructure his $4 million of toxic debt or burn his entire fake legacy to the ground. I watched the color completely drain from his face as the realization hit him. For years, he had dismissed my career as frivolous paperwork. He had worshipped his golden child while completely ignoring the daughter who was quietly climbing the ranks of the most ruthless investment firm on Wall Street. I told him that while he was busy staging fake emotional breakdowns and crying over country club memberships, I was aggressively acquiring his distress liabilities. Richard began to shake physically and violently. He reached out his hand, trembling, trying to grab my arm in a desperate plea for familial mercy. I smoothly shifted my shoulder out of his reach, looking at his outstretched hand with pure disgust. I instructed him to keep his hands to himself and focus on the math. I broke down his catastrophic failures with clinical devastating accuracy. I told him exactly how Caldwell Capital had acquired his debt. I explained that his primary lenders had recognized his dealership was a sinking ship 8 months ago. They desperately wanted off the ride, so they bundled his $4 million in commercial mortgages, inventory loans, and penalty fees, and they sold it to my division for literal pennies on the dollar. I told him that I personally authorized the purchase. I was the one who evaluated his shell corporations, laughed at his fraudulent quarterly projections, and decided his entire empire was worth less than a fraction of its stated value. I leaned in, ensuring my voice remained a low, controlled strike that only he and Jonathan could fully hear over the ballroom music. I informed him that his aggressive mezzanine financing had triggered a fatal default clause. I stated that at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the final grace period officially expired. I held all the cards, the deeds, and the leverage. He was no longer the owner of a luxury car dealership. He was merely a squatter in a building that I was about to repossess. Richard gasped for air like a drowning man. He began to frantically bargain, his voice cracking, as he promised to pay me back with interest, begging me not to do this to my own flesh and blood. He cried that this would ruin him, that Patricia would be humiliated, and that he would be left with absolutely nothing to his name. I took another calm sip of champagne. I told him that ruining him financially was merely the baseline, but the actual ultimatum involved keeping him out of a federal penitentiary. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. I explicitly brought up the $300,000. I told him I knew exactly how he had been covering his minimum interest payments over the last 4 months. I detailed the offshore accounts, the fake Delaware LLCs, and the fraudulent auto parts invoices. I stated clearly that I knew Brittany had embezzled every single cent of that money directly from Andre's logistics company to fund his failing dealership. I delivered the final non-negotiable terms. I told my father that he had exactly 48 hours. By 9 o'clock Monday morning, he was going to walk into my office in Manhattan. He was going to sign the surrender documents transferring the dealership, the inventory, and the commercial property deed directly to Caldwell Capital without a single argument or negotiation. I stated that if he refused, or if he hesitated for a fraction of a second, I would personally hand Andre's forensic corporate audit directly to the FBI. I told him he could either walk away bankrupt with a shred of his freedom, or he and his favorite daughter could face federal wire fraud charges and simultaneous prison sentences. I smiled, raised my glass in a mock toast, and told him the clock was officially ticking. Richard stared at my raised glass as if it contained lethal poison. The remaining color drained rapidly from his face, and his knees finally gave out entirely. He collapsed backward into a velvet lounge chair, clutching his chest, gasping for air that his panic-stricken lungs refused to process. He looked like a deflated, broken shell of the arrogant man who had tried to bully me just 24 hours ago. A high-pitched, hysterical shriek suddenly shattered the momentary quiet of our corner of the ballroom. Brittany had apparently recovered enough from her coat check tantrum to follow her father, and she had heard every single word of my federal fraud ultimatum. The realization that her secret offshore accounts had been exposed and that she was facing imminent prison time completely snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity she had left. She charged across the polished marble floor. Her inappropriate ivory silk gown billowed wildly behind her as she sprinted toward me. Her face was twisted into a mask of feral, unhinged rage. She screamed that I was a lying, jealous monster who was ruining her life on purpose. She raised her hands, her manicured nails curled into claws, aiming directly for my face and my French silk wedding gown. She wanted to physically tear me down because her psychological manipulations had spectacularly failed. I did not even flinch. I did not take a single step back. Before Brittany could close the final 5 feet between us, a massive, immovable wall of a man stepped smoothly into her path. Andre planted his feet firmly on the marble floor, crossing his arms and bringing her frantic, aggressive charge to a dead, jarring halt. Brittany crashed into his solid chest, bouncing off him and staggering backward, completely bewildered by her husband's sudden physical blockade. She looked up at Andre, her eyes wide and frantic, immediately attempting to switch back into her performative victim role. She reached out, trying to grab his lapels, crying for him to defend her against my vicious corporate attacks. She wailed that I was threatening to send her to jail over a tiny, misunderstood accounting error. Andre did not offer a shred of comfort. He looked down at his wife with an expression of pure glacial disgust. He stated loudly, ensuring the surrounding crowd heard him perfectly, that embezzling $312,000 from his logistics company was not a tiny accounting error. It was a calculated federal felony. Right on cue, precisely at 8 o'clock, a man dressed impeccably in the venue's catering uniform stepped out from the shadows near the bar. He walked directly up to Brittany, holding a silver catering cloche. He did not offer appetizers. He lifted the silver dome, revealing a thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished metal tray. Andre reached out, picked up the heavy stack of papers, and unceremoniously dropped them directly against Brittany's chest. She instinctively caught them, clutching the legal documents against her ivory silk bodice. Andre told her in a voice completely devoid of any remaining affection that the first document was an expedited petition for absolute divorce. He explicitly stated that he had already frozen every single joint bank account, canceled her credit cards, and locked her out of their shared penthouse apartment. Brittany stared at the divorce petition, her jaw hanging open, her fake tears entirely replaced by genuine suffocating panic. Andre pointed to the second thicker document underneath. He informed her that she was currently holding the official stamped police report he had filed with the Financial Crimes Division this morning. He told her the authorities had already reviewed the offshore routing numbers and the fake vendor invoices she had used to steal his money. His forensic accountants had recovered every single deleted email. He loudly proclaimed that she was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. She was just a pathetic, greedy fraud who got caught playing with the adults. Andre leaned in close, delivering his final lethal blow. He told his soon-to-be ex-wife that she had better savor the expensive champagne tonight because tomorrow she would be meeting with federal investigators. He advised her not to bother calling her parents for bail money since Richard was currently bankrupt and equally implicated in the wire fraud. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence, and walked over to stand right beside me and Nate, solidifying his place in our chosen family alliance. The elite guests surrounding us did not intervene. They did not offer sympathy. In the brutal world of New York high finance and corporate law, weakness and fraud were contagious diseases. The crowd physically backed away, forming a wide, empty circle of permanent social isolation around the defeated family. The absolute destruction of my biological family was a masterpiece of synchronized execution. Richard was hyperventilating in the lounge chair, fully realizing his empire was gone. Patricia had crawled over to him, weeping uncontrollably on the floor, mourning the permanent loss of her country club status. Brittany stood paralyzed in the center of the ballroom, clutching her divorce papers and her criminal indictment, utterly isolated and stripped of her golden child armor. The villains who had tormented me for 3 decades were completely simultaneously dismantled, leaving me standing victorious in the center of the wreckage. I did not even need to summon the hotel security detail. The sheer suffocating weight of total public humiliation accomplished the eviction for me. Richard remained slumped in the velvet lounge chair, his breathing ragged, his eyes fixed vacantly on the floor. He had to be physically hauled to his feet by Patricia. My mother, entirely stripped of her haughty country club arrogance, desperately tried to shield her face from the icy, calculating stares of the surrounding corporate elite. She hooked her arm under Richard's shoulder, dragging her completely bankrupt husband toward the grand ballroom exit. She attempted to hold her head high, muttering something under her breath about a sudden medical emergency, but her voice cracked and absolutely no one bought the pathetic performance. Brittany trailed behind them, a broken, hysterical mess. She was still clutching the divorce papers and the federal police report against her chest, like a shield that offered absolutely no protection. Her inappropriate ivory silk gown, originally worn to steal the wedding spotlight, now just looked like a tragic, ridiculous costume on a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. Their exit was the longest, most agonizing walk of shame I had ever witnessed. The crowd of high-powered guests parted silently, stepping back to ensure they did not accidentally brush shoulders with toxic federal liabilities. There were no hushed whispers of sympathy, no extended hands offering comfort, and no polite farewells. They walked through a brutal gauntlet of pure, unadulterated judgment. Patricia kept her eyes glued to the polished marble floor, utterly unable to meet the gaze of the influential people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Brittany let out one final pathetic sob as she crossed the threshold, looking back at Andre with a desperate, pleading expression. Andre simply turned his back to her, picking up a fresh glass of bourbon from a passing waiter without a second glance. The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them with a definitive, satisfying click. The toxic anchor that had dragged down my entire life was permanently cut loose. For a brief, suspended second, the room remained perfectly still. Then Jonathan Caldwell stepped forward, raising his crystal glass high into the air. He offered a booming, cheerful toast to the resilient bride and her brilliant groom, expertly shifting the energy of the room from a corporate execution back to a triumphant celebration. The crowd immediately erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. The jazz band struck up a lively, upbeat tempo, and the dance floor quickly filled with our real friends and loyal colleagues. Nate pulled me tightly into his arms, spinning me effortlessly to the music. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere vanished completely. The rest of the evening was a masterpiece of pure, unblemished joy, filled with incredible food, flowing champagne, and the profound, intoxicating lightness of absolute freedom. 3 weeks later, the warm Mediterranean breeze washed over the private terrace of our cliffside villa on the Amalfi Coast. Nate poured 2 glasses of crisp local wine, handing one to me as I scrolled through a brief, highly satisfying email from my legal team back in New York. The contrast between the sparkling blue Italian waters and the absolute financial carnage unfolding back in Connecticut was beautifully poetic. Exactly as I had promised, Richard failed to produce a miracle by 9 o'clock that Monday morning. He walked into the Caldwell Capital offices looking completely defeated and signed the surrender documents without uttering a single word of protest. The hostile liquidation of his luxury car dealership was executed with brutal clinical efficiency. The banks immediately seized the commercial properties, the remaining inventory was auctioned off for pennies, and the massive, heavily leveraged suburban estate he loved showing off was foreclosed upon in record time. He was left with absolutely nothing but a staggering mountain of unsecured personal debt. The social fallout for Patricia was equally swift and devastating. In the ruthless world of high society, bankruptcy, combined with a federal fraud scandal, is a totally unforgivable sin. The elite country club she had dedicated her entire life to impressing immediately revoked her membership. Her wealthy friends, the women she had spent decades gossiping with, completely ostracized her. They ignored her desperate phone calls and turned their backs whenever they saw her in public. Stripped of her wealth and her fake aristocratic status, she was forced to move with Richard into a cramped, unremarkable apartment on the outskirts of the city, permanently exiled from the luxury she worshipped. As for Brittany, the golden child finally collided with the brutal reality of the justice system. Andre did not waver for a single second. The divorce was pushed through rapidly, leaving her with absolutely zero access to his logistics empire or his personal wealth. The federal investigators took the forensic audit very seriously. Brittany was officially indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. With her offshore accounts frozen and her parents completely bankrupted, she could not even afford a basic defense attorney. She was currently awaiting trial while living in a cheap motel facing a mandatory minimum prison sentence, and an order for full financial restitution that she would be paying off for the rest of her natural life. I locked my phone screen and set the device face down on the patio table, choosing to permanently disconnect from their misery. Nate leaned back in his chair, observing the calm, unbothered expression on my face. He smiled and raised his glass to clink against mine. We did not toast to revenge or to their ultimate destruction. We simply toasted to absolute peace, to total transparency, and to the beautiful, unburdened empire we were building together entirely on our own terms. As the sun dipped below the Mediterranean horizon, casting a brilliant gold reflection across the water, I felt a profound sense of absolute closure. We returned to New York 2 weeks later, not to lingering drama or desperate apologies, but to a beautifully clean slate. One of the greatest unexpected gifts from the entire ordeal was the genuine, enduring friendship that emerged from the ashes of my biological family. Andre remained a vital, permanent part of our chosen family. Free from the constant draining financial and emotional parasitism of his marriage to my sister, his logistics company expanded exponentially. He frequently joined Nate and me for weekend dinners at our Manhattan penthouse. Our conversations completely shifted away from the trauma we had survived together, focusing entirely on future investments, global market trends, and our shared ambitions. We had bonded over a brutal, defining experience, proving unconditionally that true family is forged in the trenches of mutual respect, not assigned by random genetic chance. Looking back on the 30 years I spent desperately seeking my parents' approval, I realize now that I was trapped in the ultimate sunk cost fallacy. Society conditions us to believe that blood requires infinite forgiveness and absolute compliance. We are constantly told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, and to endlessly accommodate people who actively try to tear us down simply because we share a last name. But in the high-stakes corporate world, when a toxic asset is actively bleeding your capital and destroying your foundation, you do not keep pouring resources into it. You ruthlessly cut it loose. You restructure your portfolio. You save yourself. If you are watching this and currently shrinking your own potential to fit into a family dynamic that constantly devalues you, I need you to hear this loud and clear. Your worth is not dictated by the people who lack the fundamental vision to see your value. You do not ever need to sit quietly at a table where you are served nothing but disrespect, gaslighting, and manipulation. You have every right to stand up, buy the entire building, and permanently evict the toxic management from your life. You hold the absolute power to define your own success. Do not wait for validation from people who are deeply threatened by your strength. Surround yourself with partners and allies who celebrate your victories and stand as an impenetrable wall when the world tries to pull you under. Bloodline is simply a biological accident. Consistent respect, transparent honesty, and unwavering loyalty are what actually build a real family. When my father called me on the eve of my wedding and refused to walk me down the aisle, he fully believed he was delivering the ultimate, devastating punishment. He thought he was breaking my spirit, but in reality, he was doing me the greatest favor of my entire life. He was simply opening the door, handing me the key, and giving me the perfect opportunity to walk out of their toxic lives forever. The most profound lesson to take away from Claire's journey is that true family is forged through mutual respect and unwavering loyalty, not merely by a biological accident. For decades, Claire remained trapped in an emotional sunk cost fallacy, pouring her time and resources into a dynamic that only sought to diminish her worth in order to elevate a toxic, golden child. Society often conditions us to believe that blood ties demand infinite forgiveness, keeping us anchored to people who actively manipulate and disrespect us. However, Claire's ultimate triumph wasn't just about executing a flawless financial retaliation. It was about recognizing her own immense value and drawing an immovable boundary. She taught us that when a familial environment becomes hostile and parasitic, you do not have to stay and endure the abuse for the sake of maintaining appearances. Instead, you have the absolute right to cut ties with those who tear you down, and surround yourself with a chosen family who genuinely celebrates your victories and fiercely protects your peace. You hold the power to define your own worth. Evaluate the relationships in your life today and have the courage to permanently walk away from any table where you are no longer being served respect.